Hello everybody, this is Ian Whistler with The Media Box. Today we'll be looking at a recent indie hit, Shovel Knight. It is a 2D platformer which takes a lot of inspiration from old NES titles such as Mega Man, Ninja Gaiden, and Super Mario Bros. It also takes its art style, soundtrack, and color palette from the NES era, taking practically all of its inspiration from that era. So, without further ado, let's dive right into Shovel Knight. The game takes place in a far-off land, where we meet our hero simply named Shovel Knight. He and his partner Shield Knight went on many adventures together throughout the land, until Shield Knight was imprisoned in the Tower of Fate when the two took their adventures there. Because he lost his partner, Shovel Knight slips into a depression and spends his time wallowing in pity and mourning the loss of his friend/lover. That is, until the Enchantress, the big baddie in this world, rises to power and unseals the Tower of Fate. So with this, Shovel Knight takes up his trusty shovel once again and sets off to defeat the Enchantress and her 8 evil knights, who are referred to as the Order of No Quarter. His goal? To rescue his lost love and to free the people from the tyranny of the Enchantress. He will travel across the land, going through laboratories, frozen tundra, a submarine, a graveyard, grassy plains, and even an airship, defeating the Order of No Quarter so he may reach the Tower of Fate and save his captured love. The story is told very well with not a whole lot of dialogue. In fact, Shovel Knight's feelings for Shield Knight are mostly shown through dreams he has at night, where his love falls from the sky and he must fend off hordes of enemies and catch her. It shows how much he cares about her without it outwardly being said. Instead of using dialogue, they use the actions he takes, which is an amazing example of using actions to emphasize feelings instead of using simple dialogue. The game looks like an NES game, plain and simple. It uses the same restricted color palette the NES had, has 8-bit style graphics, and the world design is inspired by platforming titles from the NES era. The game's controls feel very tight and similar to those found in Mega Man, and that's one thing I personally enjoy very, very much. While the game does use a restricted palette, it uses that palette very well, and all of the different areas and enemies look very polished and fresh, and no designs are recycled from what I noticed. All the different levels have their own theme and feel, and I never really found myself going into a level feeling like I had experienced it or done it before. The worlds all vary in theme, so there's no recurring themes either. You travel through, as I stated earlier, grassy knolls, tundras, labs, a submarine, the dark and threatening Tower of Fate, a graveyard, and just so much more. It's very wonderful all the different things they were able to do with just so little options. The NES can only display 64 preset colors, 56 of which are unique. There were no alpha channels or 24-bit color to work with, no 8-bit palette, not even RGB settings. On top of this, it could only display 25 colors on the screen at one time, and this just goes to show how very little the Shovel Knight developers had to work with, and still deliver a very polished, good-looking game. They still were able to deliver a very good, gorgeous-looking game, and I personally think it's one of the stronger parts of the game as a whole. The ability to deliver such a good-looking game with so very little to work with is a very large challenge, and I personally think they did a wonderful, excellent job with it. The soundtrack for Shovel Knight is by far the best part of the game. Its soundtrack makes a lot of callbacks to Mega Man and older Castlevania titles, while still being completely fresh on its own. The soundtrack, keeping in line with the theme of Shovel Knight as a whole, is done as a chiptune, being mostly written by Jake Kaufman, but having some help from Manami Matsume, who wrote the legendary Mega Man soundtracks. These two succeeded in crafting a piece of musical gold. Each individual song is beautifully put together and accent the area they're in exceptionally well, but even just listening to the soundtracks alone is a wonderful experience. They hold strong on their own, and I couldn't be happier with them. The track that plays while Shovel Knight is having his dreams about Shield Knight and rescuing her is a beautiful track and probably my favorite one overall. It really exemplifies the feelings he feels towards her in just a simple tune. And it keeps its dreamlike mystery to it as well. It doesn't just feel like it was just slapped in there as part of the soundtrack. It felt like it belonged there. It didn't feel just attached on in the final product. It was part of it. It was designed and written specifically for that scene, and it accents the entire thing beautifully. It's an amazing soundtrack overall, and it's by far my favorite part of the game. How the game plays, unfortunately, is probably one of the weakest points of Shovel Knight as a whole. I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just mediocre, I think. The shovel is your main weapon of choice, and you can also use it to move dirt that's in your way and dig up treasure. It has a normal slash attack, a downward stab when you jump, a charge slash, and you can get an upgrade later on that shoots a wave along the floor when you're at full HP, much like Legend of Zelda, where you shoot beams from your sword when you're at full health. However, the most effective way to get rid of practically every enemy that you come across is the downward stab. It's the safest and 9 out of 10 the most effective way of eliminating an enemy, except certain enemies like the opponent knights, where they defend against downward stabs and you have to wait for another perfect opportunity to get a hit on them. Because of this, however, the gameplay does tend to get a little stale at times, and sometimes it just gets flat out boring. Most of the challenge of the game comes from the platforming instead of the actual combat. Some of the enemies are just placed there to get in your way while you're trying to travel across the world. There are a slew of items you can get in the game that you can use by pressing up an X, but overall they're just not all that useful. They have some uses on the world you find them in, but save the fishing rod for getting loot, the propeller dagger for getting across large gaps, and the dust knuckles for clearing dirt, most of the items don't have much worth as a whole. All the different levels tend to have a different gimmick to them also, like the graveyard level going dark and only being able to see when lightning strikes, to the lava-filled cave level where you have to get green goop to fall in the lava to turn into a bouncy material to progress. Some of the gimmicks are better than others, and because of this, some levels are kinda weak and some extremely strong. Another little piece of gameplay is you can change what kind of armor you wear, and it gives you a bunch of different abilities for some kind of drawback, like more magic but more susceptible to damage, heavier armor that protects better but hard to stop running, and a few other little fun things. Personally, I prefer the solid gold armor that gives you a unique jumping animation and makes you shine, but nothing actually useful in combat. Fashion over function is the way I go, I guess. Also, sometimes on the world map, there will be other little people running to different areas. You can travel to these people, and you'll encounter different optional battles, depending on who the person is. These optional boss fights are a lot of fun, and have some of the most interesting abilities and stories. The level design and the platforming is the strongest part of the gameplay, because most of the worlds are very well designed, and come with a lot of challenge. Some of them are exceptionally challenging in comparison to others, like for instance the graveyard. Platforming when you can't see the platforms is extremely difficult, especially when there are enemies coming at you which you most of the time can't see. Another good example of this is the airship level, which is much more vertically inclined than horizontally inclined. It involves a lot of climbing up ladders, falling platforms, and using the propeller dagger to get from one point to the other. The map uses the propeller dagger, which you get on that level, very well, and it's not really visited that much more after that. The propeller dagger after that is mostly just used to get over some obstacles which you'd rather avoid. My least favorite world overall is probably the underwater level or the submarine level. This is because it uses water physics, and while it does use them well, water physics just aren't that fun to play around with. During most of the level, there are spikes hanging above you, which you have to properly input your jump, so it's not high enough to where you're getting hit by the spikes, but high enough so you can get to where you need to go. Most of the platforms also rise up towards the spikes, which means you have to properly time your fall so you land on the next platform. While this may seem fun, it gets really tedious as the level goes on, because this is the majority of what the platforming is about, dealing with the water physics. I personally didn't enjoy it. Some might, but I just think that the water physics as a whole just did not appeal to the level. I feel like the level could have been designed much better to where it wasn't reliant on slow, properly timed jumps and falling onto platforms that are going to rise to your death. On a lighter note, overall, I feel the level design is very polished and well done. Most of the levels have very fun, enjoyable gimmicks that make it a lot of fun to platform through the levels. There are some exceptions, like I've mentioned, that I didn't enjoy, but overall I think it was very well done, very polished, and very solid. My biggest criticism overall is that most of the items just don't really have that much use unless you purposely use them to clear obstacles. Additionally, the actual usage of the shovel, the combat isn't really all that great. It's mostly just about getting past the enemies to continue platforming through the level, not about having a good battle tactics. For me, I think it's one of the weakest parts of the game, but that being said, it's not bad. It's just mediocre at best. So, after you've upgraded your armor, upgraded your shovel, and defeated all of the Order of No Quarter, you travel to the Tower of Fate, where you face your arch-rival, the Black Knight. Your first encounter with him is the end of the first level of the game, and this time, he's powered with dark magic given to him by the Enchantress. After defeating him, we learn that his ultimate goal is the same as Shovel Knight's, to rescue Shield Knight from the Tower of Fate. It's just his way of doing it was different than our heroes. Shovel Knight then travels into the Tower of Fate to defeat the Enchantress once and for all. The Tower of Fate is treacherous and is split into two parts, getting to the tower and the interior of the tower. Before you reach the top of the tower, there's one last thing you must do. You fall into all of the Order of No Quarter having a feast, and you enter into a boss rush, and you must defeat the entire order again. You get a health regen after every fight, but you have to pick it up before it disappears. After defeating the order once more, they dangle before you, holding onto the tower for dear life. Being the good knight you are, you help them all up, and then proceed to the final chamber to defeat the evil Enchantress. She taunts you that your beloved is gone, and there's nothing you can do. Being the resolute hero you are, you choose to fight the Enchantress and defeat her, and reveal that she was a dirty liar and Shield Knight is freed, and you catch her, just like in your dreams. But all is not well, as it is revealed that you have one more final fight with the Enchantress at full power, but it is not only you this time, but you and Shield Knight together, as a dynamic duo. You jump off Shield Knight's shield, of course, to damage the huge Enchantress, and after a hard fight you manage to defeat the Enchantress. But she refuses to go down that easily, and she unleashes all of her power, trying to destroy Shovel Knight with her. But Shield Knight takes the attack for Shovel Knight, telling him to flee while he can. He escapes without her, and the tower crumbles to the ground. The credits roll, and we see how all of the Order of No Quarter turn their evil lairs into things that aren't, well, so evil after all. At the end of it all, we see Shield Knight limp to our hero and cuddle up with him by the campfire. And with that, it's the end. A very sweet and emotional end to a very lovely story. Overall, I rather enjoyed the game. I had a lot of fun with all the different levels, varying gimmicks they had, and the gameplay as a whole in some places. The soundtrack was phenomenal, as I said, and the story is sweet and wonderfully executed. Shield Knight and Shovel Knight are a very well explained and well developed duo, even with so little interaction they have with one another. All of the Order of No Quarter are very unique, and each of their individual boss fights were a ton of fun, and each different from the other. I had a good time with the game as a whole. I just feel that some of the gameplay could have been developed a little better. Overall, Shield Knight gets a 7.5 out of 10.